Where is it that history comes from? The facts and figures, the details of history. I know history books, but where do they get those to put in the history books? Now, some history is so well known to us that we just, take it for granted. George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, Betsy Ross sewing the American flag, Paul Revere and his midnight ride, and Pocahontas saving Captain John Smith's neck. The problem with that is that history is the historical equivalent to fake news. See, those things didn't really happen, or they didn't happen exactly the way that we remembered them. Those are great stories that fit a narrative, but they're not really historical in the sense that they happen just like that. History is much more complex and subtle. Piecing together what really happened in the past comes from original sources, complex, detailed reading and studying of laws that were passed, contracts that were made, newspaper reports, and personal letters. Sometimes personal letters are fascinating ways to learn about history. We mentioned before that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams exchanged almost 400 personal letters with one another after they left their presidencies. They had been bitter enemies, they became great friends. And reading those letters don't just tell us more about Jefferson and Adams, but they tell us a lot about their life and times in the world. So a lot of information from colonial America are gleaned from those personal letters. And sometimes when you're reading letters like that, or letters that Sigmund Freud wrote to a couple of his friends, where he voiced sort of doubts about some of his theories, letters that were exchanged between Josephine and Napoleon that tells not just about their relationship, about what's happening in the world. You look at that, they're very personal, they're very private, and sometimes you feel like you're reading somebody else's mail, but they tell us something really important about what was going on. And that's what we found in this series that we've been slogging through almost for 18 weeks now in 2 Corinthians. Some of Paul's letters aren't that personal. In fact, Paul stayed longer at Ephesus than any other single congregation that we know about. But if you read Corinthians, there's no personal information in there at all. He doesn't address anybody by name. In fact, most scholars believe that Ephesians was written not just to the church at Ephesus, but was intended to be a cyclical letter that was meant to be passed around from church to church in a general area. We know that he tells the church at Colossae to share their letter with Laodicea and read the letter that he wrote. So sometimes letters are meant for different audiences. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing with his heart on his sleeve. He is trying to piece together a relationship that he had, a close relationship with Corinth. And because that relationship had gone a little bit south, because a group of people that he refers to in 2 Corinthians as super apostles had come into the church and sort of convinced the church to go in a different direction. They were opposing Paul, and they were trying to undercut his authority. So in the last 3 chapters of 2 Corinthians, Paul has to defend himself and his apostolic authority in order to defend his message. And to Paul, that feels a lot like boasting. In fact, he apologizes over and over again, even to the point of saying, I must be out of my mind to talk like this. But in order to defend his message and his truth, he has to defend himself a little bit. Well, in the text, we come to the second half of chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. Paul's going to bring that boasting to an end. So we want to look at what he says in this half a chapter today, and then at the end, make some practical applications to our lives as Christians today. He starts out like this in verse 11. I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, quote, unquote, even though I am nothing. Paul blames them. You should have known me well enough. Paul stays at Corinth for longer than any other place besides Ephesus. And so you should have known me by now. And I've had made a fool of myself boasting like this, but you drove me to it. You ought to be commending me. But I am superior. He says I'm not inferior. But what he's saying is you should have trusted me more than these false teachers, these super apostles that have led you astray. And you drove me to this boasting. When I was a kid, Dad and I used to like to watch a Western together. I think it was only on for 3 seasons. It was called The Guns of Will Sonnet. And in this show, Walter Brennan plays a grandfather who is traipsing around the West, having adventures, of course, that's what the show was about, with his grandson. And they're traveling looking for the boy's father, his son, who is Jim Sonnet, the world-famous gunfighter. And almost every week he would make a speech like this. Somebody would say something about Jim Sonnet being the fastest gun in the West. And Walter Brennan would say in his distinctive voice, Jim is the 3rd fastest gun in the West. The boy is faster than him, and I'm better than both of them. No brag, just fact. And that became kind of a watchword for Dad and I. We would say something, and then we'd, append, no brag, just fact. Well, that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying to the Corinthians, I have more authority. I should be listened to more than these Johnny-come-lately super apostles that have captured your attention with their fancy rhetoric and smooth words. But you should have been listening to me. I'm better than them. No brag, just fact. And you have forced me into defending myself, and I'm not very comfortable doing that. He continues in verse 12, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, signs and wonders and mighty works. Again, he's saying, you should know me. I was there. I lived among you. I worked among you. I did God's power among you. My gospel didn't come to you with words only, but with great patience, he says here in the New Revised Standard, with perseverance in the NIV. I performed these great signs, these miracles, these mighty works. And so you should have listened. You should have known me better than that. In 1 Corinthians, he reminded them, my message and my preaching were not with wise words and wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Paul didn't come with learned rhetoric. He didn't speak like a professional speaker. You know, when you go to the used car, we don't have used car salesmen here. You go to the used car lot and you walk on the lot and you start looking at a car. The guy comes up and he's got this polished speech. Tell you what I'm going to, he tries to talk you. But you realize he's a professional talker. And so you've got to take some of what he says with a grain of salt. Paul said, I'm not like that. The snake oil salesman, that's the super apostles. You should have listened to me because I demonstrated, not just with my words, but with my life and with the power of God, I demonstrated that what I said was true. Now he said, there was one thing that I didn't do with you that I did do with other churches. He says this in the next verse, how were you inferior to other churches, except that I never was a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. What he's talking about is while he was at Corinth, he didn't take a paycheck. He decided in this very materialistic, greedy culture, the most successful city in the Roman Empire, except maybe for Rome itself, he decided that he was not going to take pay from the church, but rather would support himself. So he worked with Aquila and Priscilla in the tent-making business. He was a tent maker or a leather worker. Tents in those days were made out of animal hides or animal hair. And so he worked with that until he got a contribution, some support from the Philippian church. And so then he was able to quit his day job and devote full time for preaching. And so here he said, the only way that I mistreated you is I worked for free and never took a paycheck. So excuse me, he says. That's why I'm always very careful to cash my paycheck. I don't want to offend anyone. That's what Paul says. Maybe I should have charged you and you would appreciate me more than you seem to be doing right now. And so then he says in verse 14, now I'm ready to visit you for a third time, and I'll not be a burden to you because what I want is not your possessions, but you. So what he says is, I'm coming to see you, and I still don't expect you to pay me because I don't want your money. I want your hearts. I want you to listen. I want the kind of relationship that we enjoyed before this problem comes up. And he says, and this is where the title of today's sermon comes from, third time's a charm. This is the third visit I'm going to come to you. The first time was when he established the church. The second time was a very hastily planned, painful visit because he came to try to solve some of their problems and they rejected him, which led him to write this very severe letter that he says in 2 Corinthians was almost sorry that he sent because it was so fiery, but it caused them to repent. So this is the third time. And he said, this is going to be the charm. This is going to decide whether or not our relationship is going to be able to continue, whether you're going to be able to continue in your relationship with Christ in the way that he wants you to. In chapter 13, which we'll look at next week, he again states, this will be my third visit. And then he ties it to the Old Testament. Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So this is like the third witness. And I'm waiting to see, and God is waiting to see how this visit is going to go. So get ready. I'm afraid that I'm going to have to deal with some folks that aren't very penitent. They may act like everything is okay, but behind the scenes, they are spreading discord and trying to get people not to listen to me. And so I might have to be a little bit tougher than I really want to be. So he says in verse 20, I am afraid that when I come, I might not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. In other words, he's afraid he's going to have to drop the hammer one more time. He says, I'm afraid that when I come, there's going to be some folks that are still rebelling against the gospel and that I'm going to have to be stern with. So I'm not going to find you like I want to find you. And that means I'm not going to be nearly as easygoing and laid back as you would like me to be. But it is up to you. Now he goes on to say that what he's afraid he's going to find, the second part of verse 20, I fear there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. That's what he's afraid to find among this little cadre of false apostles that are kind of drawing people out and causing them not to listen to Paul or his message. That's the way that church problems are fed, right? There's jealousy and there's discord. People get angry. There's people that are in it for themselves, selfish ambition. We looked at Wednesday night. The word selfish ambition really comes from an original word that referred to a day laborer. This is somebody that would show up in the marketplace waiting for wealthy landowners to come and hire them for the day. And the reason that came to be known as selfish ambition is the day laborers would elbow each other out of the way, trying to go, pick me, pick me. So you try to promote yourself at the expense of other people. That's what's driving the problems in the church there at Corinth. Slander, gossip, arrogance, disorder. See, what happens is when someone has an agenda, they may act like everything is fine where they're at church all smiley and everything is fine, you know, because you ask them and they'll tell you just fine. But behind the scenes, they're calling people on the phone. Of course, they wouldn't have done that in Paul's day, but they're calling people on the phone and whispering and gossiping and trying to transfer their dissatisfaction to other people as they gain people after them. And so Paul says, when I come, I'm afraid that's what I'm going to find. And he goes on to say these folks that are spreading all of that, causing all the problem, have an agenda. And he refers again to what that agenda seems to be. I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged. You see, the people that were spreading, trying to get folks not to listen to Paul, not pay attention to his message, not listen to his teaching, they had an agenda. And that agenda was they really didn't want to live like Christians. They wanted to live more like the culture around them. Earlier in our study, we came across chapter 10 and verse 2, where Paul says, I beg you when I come. Again, he knows he's coming and he knows some people need to get ready. When I may not have to be as bold as I expect towards some people. And here's what the teachers were teaching, who think that we live by the standards of this world. And so he says, in chapter 12 that I'm afraid that what I'm going to find is people haven't repented from what? from living like the standards of this world. People that are living, well, they claim to believe Christian things, but they find it just easier to live like a Corinthian. They believe in Christ and they believe in the church and they come and they worship, but then they want to go to the pagan temples and they want to misbehave and they want to live like the world around them. They believe like a Christian, but live like a Corinthian. They go on sinning so that grace may increase. And Paul's already made it very clear what he feels about that. John makes it clear to us that whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Christian means, the word Christian, belonging to Christ or being like Christ. I mean, either one of those two things. And so if I claim to be a Christian, well, John says, if you claim to live in him, you must live like him. Our goal is to live Christ-like lives. Now, we'll never get there. We're never going to be perfect. Nobody will ever get to the point where we can throw up our hands and say, well, I've finally gotten here. I've arrived at being like Jesus. We're not going to do that, but that's our goal, and that's our calling. That is the walk that we have. That's really what John says here, literally. We must walk as he walked. We must walk in the footsteps of Jesus as best we can as we seek to live for him and as we seek to reflect him to the world around us. But what the Corinthians wanted to do, what these false teachers wanted the church to do, let's believe like Christians, but let's live like Corinthians. And Paul says that option isn't open to them. We are called, you and I, as Christians, to be like Christ and to belong to Christ, to live for him in a world that does not recognize his lordship. The Hebrew writer talks about, we don't see the world all falling before Jesus, but we see Jesus. Unlike the world around us, we are to live in a way that glorifies Christ. And the Hebrew writer and Peter and others warn us that if we really do that, we're going to find ourselves sort of out of step with the world around us. The Hebrew writer talks about those great examples of faith in Hebrews 11 and how they walked by faith. And he goes on to say that they lived by faith, but they lived as strangers and pilgrims in a world that was not their own. Peter goes on to say that we are to live as foreigners here in reverent fear. That if we are living for Christ, we're going to be kind of at odds with the world around us. We may stand out from the world around us. We will be different. And that call to be different does not simply mean that we pick a couple of different moral positions that we take that sort of fit in line with what people like us are supposed to believe, but rather we take upon ourselves the task of doing our very best to replicate the values and life of Jesus Christ in the world that we're called to live in. And that's a whole lot harder. For example, the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. Paul says the acts of the flesh are obvious, and then he goes on to list some of them. Here's some of the things he lists. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft. Well, is it really hard to take a position on those? Okay, some of us may have to fine-tune our views of sexual immorality, but debauchery, I'm against it. I don't know what that is, but I'm against it. Idolatry, we don't worship idols. In fact, a friend of mine, when we were in youth group years ago, went out and actually we went to, it was at Price Club, is where we got it, which is kind of a forerunner of Costco. We bought crucifixes, and because we wanted to wear a crucifix at school because a lot of our friends were doing that to show that they were Christians. But to be honest with you, we sort of did it because we know it would hack off a bunch of people at church. Because you're not supposed to wear religious jewelry because that's like idolatry. And we're against idolatry. And we're against witchcraft. I can't tell you how many articles that I read that wanted to make me feel bad because I liked reading Harry Potter books. We can't be that. Can't do that. It's, Wizard of Oz. I've heard people against the Wizard of Oz, at least the parts in color, because it glorified witchcraft. We got to be against witchcraft. This being called to be Christian is not about picking out the things that I'm really not tempted to do anyway and be against those, but rather be committed to a life that honors Christ and seeks to be Christ on earth, to live like he lived, to walk as he walked. So continue the works of the flesh. How about these? Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, which is related, it's kind of like greed, selfishness, materialism, which is kind of the world that we live in. I'm really supposed to be against hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, dissensions, and factions? Man, that just leaves all of social media off. That leaves cable news off. That leaves politics off. Christians sometimes pride themselves because we're so good at dissensions and factions and fits of rage. But if we're going to replicate the life of Christ, we've got to be against those things. We've got to show the life of Jesus in our own lives. And I'm convinced that if you and I were as careful to live out the second half, the works of the flesh, and particularly to take on ourselves love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control, the fruit of the Spirit, if we showed that in our lives all the time, we would look as weird to the world as the Amish look to us. We would stand out. It would make us different. Paul is telling the church at Corinth that they cannot continue to live by the standards of the world. That's easy. It's easy just to believe Christian things and then live like a Corinthian. It's easy to believe Christian things and just continue to live like all the Americans around us. If you're going to live for Christ, however, that's going to make you different. Paul wants us to know that the option of just believing like Christ and living like we want is not an option to us. It's not open to us. In fact, that's really the reason that we're here today. Really. You see, sometimes people wonder, why do you have to go to church to worship? I can worship anywhere. You can worship anywhere. I hope you are worshiping everywhere. If you pray while you're driving, you don't have to close your eyes. Just want to make that rule clear. I hope you are praying while you're driving and singing praise songs and all of that. The reason that we're here is not to worship God. It is to worship God together. We are here to encourage one another to love and good deeds. We are here to assemble around the table of the Lord to remind ourselves of the commitment we've made to the cross to live. And therefore we encourage each other to go out and live what we say we believe. That's why we're here today. To remind ourselves we're called to live for Christ. Not just believe like a Christian, but live like someone who is committed to Him. May God help us to be as careful about the way that we live as we are about what we believe. That we can't live like the world around us. Let's pray together.